It's a real pleasure to have Dr. Castellví here. Dr. Luis Castellví Laukamp obtained his PhD at the University of Cambridge, and he's a senior lecturer at the University of Manchester. Senior lecturer is the UK equivalent of associate professor. He specializes in early modern Hispanic cultural studies and is the author of Hispanic Baroque Ekphrasis, Góngora, Camargo, and Sor Juana, published by Cambridge University Press in 2020. He has written several articles and book chapters, too long to kind of go over them, on a wide range of topics, ranging from canonical works of Iberian early modern literature, such as Góngora, Soledad I, to historical chronicles of the conquest and colonization of both the Pacific, which is today's topic, and the Atlantic, Spanish territory. In addition to this transatlantic and trans-Pacific approach, Dr. Castellví Laukamp has also published on a wide range of dissimilar literary genres, ranging from Camargo's epic poem on San Ignatius to Sor Juana's philosophical poem Primero Sueño, to Chirino's missionary history on the Philippines, and Rodriguez Freire's El Carnet, which is the topic that kind of brought us together. Dr. Castellví is currently working on a monograph project that examines the foundational texts written in the decades following the colonial establishment of Manila, the Philippines, in 1571, in order to reconsider the pivotal role that these often understudied corpus had in shaping the cultural and intellectual history of 17th century, and not only 17th century, of the world today. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that Dr. Castellví is also an accomplished translator. His most recent work is a translation into Spanish of Percy Shelley's poem Julian and Madelon, which book presentation I had the pleasure to attend in his native Barcelona. Luis, it's a real joy to have you with us today. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Alberto, for this generous and kind presentation, and thank you to the university for the invitation. I'm very pleased, very happy to be here for the first time in Georgia. And today I'm going to present part of my work, of this work in progress, which is this monograph about the Spanish chronicles about the Philippines. Now, since this topic is not something that is usually studied, because most of us Hispanists either focused on the Iberian Peninsula or on Latin America, but not so much on the Philippines, I'm going to devote a bit more time than usual to the context, to the introduction, before I present my paper and my thesis today. And I'm not going to read, which means I might lose a bit of accuracy, but I hope to make this topic more engaging and interesting. And I'll welcome questions and feedback afterwards, of course. So I started studying the Philippines actually 10 years ago in the United States, precisely. And I was fascinated when I found out that as a PhD student, that there was this binary that I mentioned earlier, but actually we tend to forget that Spain also had colonial possessions in other continents, notably in Asia. The Philippines was a Spanish colony for 333 years. And there was also Equatorial Guinea in West Africa. And you know, most departments of Spanish, they have this binary, and the Philippines and Equatorial Guinea are simply ignored or forgotten or mentioned in passing. And I thought it would be interesting to explore, well, what was written or what was produced in Spanish and other languages throughout this long colonial period, you know, in the Philippines, from the 16th century to the late 19th century, to 1898. And this is what made me interested in the chronicles, and I started to explore the first texts that were written in Spanish in Asia. We are very familiar with the canonical Spanish-American chronicles. You know, we have countless papers and books on Cortés, Inca Garcilaso, etc. But there's another corpus of equally canonical, at least in the Philippines, chronicles and texts that are not really widely studied or known in the West. And even in the Philippines, to be honest, they are not always studied in depth, among other reasons because Spanish is no longer really spoken or widely spoken in the Philippines. Spanish is a dead language in the Philippines. No? And that places this corpus in a kind of limbo, no? And that's one of the reasons why they are understudied. I took this picture in February during a research stay in the University Santo Tomas. This is the oldest university in Asia. It was founded by a Spanish bishop in 1611, and it has the most important collections of early modern materials and manuscripts of any library in the Philippines. So if any of you is interested in the topic, this is the place. The University of Santo Tomas is the place to go. This is the corpus that I'm focusing on for my monograph, which is entitled The Philippines in the Making, Spanish Trans-Pacific Chronicles. All of these works are extremely interesting. I would say they were written or published in the late 16th, early 17th century, which is a very important period because, as Alberto mentioned, Manila was founded on the year 1571, and then 2 decades later it had already consolidated itself as a major city in Southeast Asia, and it was the place that Spain used to start diplomatic relations and trade with neighboring countries, notably China and Japan. So all of that happened in the late 16th, early 17th century. That's why I consider that period really crucial in the history of the colony. I'm going to focus today on this chronicle by Ribadeneira, but I will say that probably the most important of these texts is the first one, the Boxer Codex, about which I talked a bit this morning in Alberto's lecture, and I would encourage you to Google it and look for information about it because it's a fascinating text with 100 illuminations, it's a manuscript. It was never published, and it wasn't discovered until the 20th century, a bit like Wamampoma. And I suspect, I have the intuition, this will be considered by far the most important of all the chronicles of the Philippines, the Boxer Codex. But today I'm going to talk about Marcelo de Ribadeneira, who wrote an equally interesting chronicle about the connection between the Philippines and Japan, and particularly about the martyrdom of 26 Christians who were crucified in Nagasaki in February 1597. So Marcelo de Ribadeneira witnessed that martyrdom. He was there in Nagasaki in February 1597, and he survived, and he returned to Europe where he wrote, well, he started writing the chronicle in the Philippines, and later he published it in Europe. So I'm going to focus on that chronicle. Note the title, which is a bit, might seem a bit bizarre to us nowadays. It's so long, right? It betrays a lack of notion of Asia. Instead of using the term Asia, which is what we would say today, or Southeast Asia, he just starts to name all the territories about which he's going to write. History of the islands of the archipiélago, that is the Philippines, and the kingdoms of Gran China, Tartaria, Cochinchina, Malacca, Siam, Cambodia, and Japan. This is, as far as I know, the first religious chronicle that focused on the Philippines, among other territories. And it's also an interesting book because it's the book that Ribadeneira, who was a Franciscan missionary himself, used to try to promote the beatification and canonization of these martyrs. According to some scholars, there might have been an earlier edition in Rome in 1599, but if it ever existed, there are no extant copies. Every time I've had a chance to examine the book, it has been always in this Barcelona edition. Few biographical details about Ribadeneira. He was born, if I'm not mistaken, 1561, and then he, like many missionaries, he went to the Philippines via Mexico, and he spent 2.5 years in Japan. So from the Philippines he went to Japan, even though Christianity had already been forbidden as a religion in Japan, and there was the risk of being sentenced to death if you were Christian in early modern Japan, and yet he decided to go there, and he managed to spend 2.5 years there before his expulsion in March 1597. Okay. Then he returned to Europe via Spain. He managed to published this book in 1601. He stayed in Rome for some time trying to promote the beatification of these martyrs, and then we lose track of him. He possibly died in 1606, but that's basically his life in a nutshell. A bit of an obscure figure. I mean, he's not a major canonical author in literary studies, but for scholars of religion, for instance, studying martyrdom, or particularly those crucifixions of Nagasaki, 1597, which is quite an important event for early modern Europe as well, his name comes up a lot. So it is Ribadeneira, and this book that I'm going to focus on. Here you can see the frontispiece of that first edition of Barcelona, 1601. You can see the very long title mentioning almost every known territory in Southeast Asia. And then there's this emphasis that the author of the book is a testigo de vista de su admirable martirio. So he's a witness. He's someone who was there. He's someone who saw. He's not an armchair historian. No? And as you know, in the field of the chronicas, chroniclers who were there, who happened to be in the Americas, or in this case in Southeast Asia, they make a whole point out of that they saw with their own eyes what they are telling you. No? So therefore they claim that they are more reliable often than historians who didn't happen to travel, no? As was often the case in the early modern period. There's also this interesting image here. There's the Latin phrase militatis armis Christi Francisco proles. So these are the weapons of the offspring of St. Francis. So it's kind of an epic rhetoric of conquest. And then well, we have the heart pierced by 2 lances, and the arms of Jesus Christ and St. Francis, and also the stigmata underneath. I mean, I could say more about this, but I think as an introduction that should serve. And I would like now to present what actually is my thesis, or the argument that I want to develop in my paper today. Because as you, I assume most of you are literary scholars or students of literature, not necessarily historians. I'm not a historian myself, and this is a disclaimer with which I would like to start. Even though I'm studying texts that are historical, or that are more studied in departments of history than in literature, I study these texts and approach them as a literary scholar. So I follow in the footsteps of the work of scholars like Hayden White, metahistory, for instance, and I understand that these historical texts can be approached from a literary perspective as well. And in fact, they are full of what we would call today supernatural events, or magical realism, avant la lettre, or miracles, etc. And that's something I'm interested in as a literary scholar. I want to see what kind of literary tropes and techniques these authors are using, because as you know, the border between, or the distinction between literature and history in the early modern period was razor thin, really. And many texts written as history, we can study them as literature today. In fact, I would even argue that we understand them better as literature than as history in many cases. And that's the underlying assumption or premise of my project. So my thesis is twofold. One thesis is very simple, and the other is a bit more elaborate. The simple thesis is that Ribadeneira is publishing this book in order to promote the religious agenda of his order. So there are these 26 martyrs, 23 of them were Franciscan, and the other 3 were Jesuits. And he wants to promote their beatification and canonization, as I said. So he went to Rome and he published this book to promote that goal. And that's something very typical of various religious orders within the Catholic Church. Whenever there had been an episode of martyrdom, or simply they wanted their founder to be canonized, as it happened with Ignatius Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, we often find figures like that, missionaries of each religious order who go to Rome and publish a chronicle or a book in order to try to promote that religious goal. That would be my first thesis. The second thesis is that in order to reach that goal, or to drive home that point, Ribadeneira is not just relying on his own experience as a witness, but he's also resorting to all sorts of tropes and topoi from a very modest corpus of literature that he never acknowledges. And I'm referring to something that we call in Spanish literatura de cordel, which I believe you can translate in English as broadsides or broadsheets of street literature or chapbooks. Do you know what I'm talking about? What I'm referring to? It's very simple, really. Books in the early modern world were still expensive, and many people couldn't afford them. So what became very popular throughout the early modern Spain, Latin America, even the Philippines, even in Japan, they would just print some kind of sensationalist story, like about a historical event, you know, a pirate attack or a natural disaster, or some kind of a story about a martyrdom or a miracle. They would just print them in 4 papers like this. Literatura de cordel, because you could just hang it on a cordel, like on a string, and then you could buy it. It was very cheap. And this type of literature, cheap literature, often anonymous, often distasteful, was actually extremely popular. In fact, some of these broadsides circulated widely throughout the Spanish Empire and beyond. It's something that you find in Brazil as well, and I mean almost everywhere. No? These broadsides of street literature or literatura de cordel often depict episodes of martyrdom. And of course they use the most sensationalist, gory details you can imagine, because that's what people like to read. That's what people found entertaining or interesting. No? And I would argue, and I'll show some examples to prove that point, that Ribadeneira was an avid reader of that type of literature, and that even though he's writing an official history of the Franciscans, he's actually often trying to pander to this type of popular taste of people who wanted blood, people who wanted these kind of gory descriptions of martyrdom. And so that would be my second thesis, that there's a connection between the Chronicle of Ribadeneira and this very modest and fascinating corpus that I would encourage you to read. I don't know to what extent that's a corpus of literature that is studied in the US or within Hispanism in US academia, but it's something that I would encourage you to take a look at some point of your studies, because it is a fascinating field of literature, because it's very rough, you know. There are things that you don't find that are more nuanced, ideologies that appear in more nuanced manner in like highbrow literature, but when you look at those broadsides, you see things like put in a more direct manner, I would say. Okay, so let's start then, and I think my presentation will be chronological in the sense that, sorry, this is just the structure of Ribadeneira's chronicle. As you can see, he devotes half of his book to Japan, 1/3 to the Philippines, and then just 1/6 to China. He also, in his book, contains one of the earliest descriptions that we know of Buddhism, like one of the earliest European descriptions of Buddhism. Today I'm going to focus on book 5, which is his description of his crucifixion of Nagasaki, and I'm going to do it chronologically, okay? I'll start with the antecedents, then the crucifixion itself, and then the aftermath. And I'll focus on these supernatural events and to strengthen my 2 theses, my 2 arguments about the canonization and the broadsides. So, the first relevant section for our purposes is chapter 25 of book 4, in which basically Ribadeneira starts to describe all sorts of supernatural events that hover between the apocalyptical and the millenarian. So, months before the imprisonment of those martyrs, Ribadeneira says that a comet was observed on the sky. There was rain of all sorts of materials you wouldn't expect, like rain of earth, of hair and worms falling from the sky. There are storms, earthquakes, mountains splitting open, all sorts of natural events, supernatural events, that are somehow anticipating that future martyrdom. No, it's according to his story, it's like as if God was trying to convey the idea or the message that something important is going to happen in this land. And of course, that's something that you find in those broadsides of street literature. I mean, I found one, for instance, a broadside published in Alcalá in 1596, in which the Virgin Mary herself appears to two soldiers to warn them or to reveal them that they would suffer a martyrdom in the future. No? So this idea of a supernatural anticipation of a future martyrdom is something that you find in this corpus of literature. Although sometimes I think that Ribadeneira maybe is also borrowing this idea from more like highbrow sources like epic literature. At the end of the day, even though he's writing a history book, he presents these martyrs as heroes. And I think he might be borrowing as well tropes that you find in classic epics of ancient Greece and Rome, like this idea of a comet announcing a future important event. You find that in the classics as well. So it might not be, I'm focusing on those broadsides because that's what I'm interested in. But I don't claim or I don't pretend that his sources weren't broader than that. And I think epic literature in particular would be another interesting point of comparison. From the viewpoint of gender, I think the topic of martyrdom is interesting to the study of masculinity, in the sense that Ribadeneira uses this adjective varonil throughout the book. He starts to use it when the martyrs are in prison, and the first torture they were victims of was that their left ears were mutilated. And then basically Ribadeneira conveys the message that no one complained, that they were very masculine, very strong, very resilient. And that's, of course, an idea you find in these broadsides of street literature as well. I mean, I did a thorough panoramic research of all the broadsides published in this period that are devoted to the topic of martyrdom. I found 14 of them, and of these, only 3 feature women as protagonists. No? So I would argue that martyrdom was associated in the early modern period, was predominantly framed in masculine terms. No? So there was the idea that these missionaries who suffered martyrdom, they died as men, so to speak. No? So that there was a way a missionary, a priest could die as a man. And there was also this notion, sanguis martyrum semen Christianorum, the blood of martyrs is the seed of Christians, in the sense that the bloodshed of the martyrs would inspire not only future vocations of priests in Europe, but also conversions of pagans, no? Notably in the context of Japan. So these are the type of ideas regarding masculinity and priesthood that circulated in the early modern world, and that I would say Ribadeneira illustrates very well in his chronicle. Then after the mutilation of the left ear, the martyrs were exhibited or paraded in chariots all around the city of Kyoto. And then of course, that of course serves Ribadeneira to make this comparison of the martyrs with the triumphs of ancient Rome. You might know that in ancient Rome there was this custom that after a successful military campaign, the emperor would exhibit the spoils of war and the slaves that had been captured to the enemy. And Ribadeneira makes this comparison explicit, ¿no? Quedan sepultados con eterno olvido los famosos triunfos de los emperadores romanos, ¿no? So the point he's making is these martyrs are being exhibited in what seems to be a public humiliation, ¿no? In these chariots all around Kyoto. But in fact, it's the complete opposite. This is like a glorious parade because they are being humiliated, tortured, and executed because of their faith, and therefore they will go straight to heaven. You know? And he keeps drawing these comparisons between the early modern martyrs and the triumphs of ancient Rome. He might have seen the Arch of Titus in Rome that represents very well that notion, or that idea of the Roman triumph. This is, as a side note, the arch that inspired Percy Shelley in his last masterpiece, The Triumph of Life, which entirely revolves around this idea of the Roman triumph. Or even in Mexico, you might have seen, because Petrarch, the great Italian poet, wrote a classic book entitled I Trionfi, and there's a whole gallery of frescoes in Puebla, in Mexico, inspired by that poem of Petrarch. No? So there are multiple possibilities in terms of visual sources that might have inspired Ribadeneira's account, and he develops that comparison at great length. When it comes, sorry, the last thing about the antecedents, it was a long walk that these martyrs were forced to undertake, because as I said, they were captured in Kyoto. That's where they were paraded and exhibited in these chariots that I mentioned. But then they were forced to walk 1,000 kilometers, which in miles, I'm not sure how much that would be in miles.
600
miles, okay. And that was in, thank you, that was in winter in Japan, which was a very cold winter. And it was precisely in Nagasaki where the Japanese emperor wanted to have them executed, and I think that was a very meaningful decision, because Nagasaki was founded by European missionaries, the Jesuits, in 1571 precisely, which is the same year of the foundation of Manila. No? So he wanted to have them executed there as a kind of public example. No? And I think it was more relevant to him the location of those of the crucifixion rather than the choice of the specific victims. Okay, so this is what I wanted to say about the antecedents, and now I'll move on to the actual crucifixion, which is, as you can imagine, I mean, if you look at the historical sources, you will see that basically this was a diplomatic and also in many ways a historical or political failure of the Spanish Empire. But of course, Ribadeneira cannot present that historical event in negative terms, and he presents it as the complete opposite, as a glorious event of world historical significance that completely changed the history of Spain and Southeast Asia. And certainly, especially after the beatification of these martyrs, there were many engravings and paintings, and there they are omnipresent. I mean, you can find references to the Nagasaki martyrs almost in any European country, and also in Mexico and other places. This is, for example, a German engraving that represents faithfully the way they were crucified, because they were not nailed to the crosses, but actually like tied to them with some rings, argollas, we would say in Spanish. And you can see a ship here in the horizon on the right of the image, and that is actually the place where Ribadeneira was, because he was confined on a Portuguese ship, and it was from the sea that he witnessed the event. For the purposes, sorry, I just wanted to show another engraving. This is a Jesuit engraving, a classic Jesuit book about martyrdom. Note that he's only representing 3 crucified people instead of 26. Why is he doing that?
Because they're just
Sorry?
The only Jesuit.
The only Jesuit. I mean, religious orders were very, very competitive and very provincial, and there were 3 Jesuits. He's a Jesuit, so that's the engraving of Nagasaki. Only the 3 members of his order. No? I mean, there was a very fierce competition between Jesuits and Franciscans, because in theory the Jesuits had the monopoly to evangelize Japan, and therefore they weren't very happy when Franciscans started to arrive in the 1590s, and that could explain that type of very reductive representation. In terms of my argument about the canonization, the future canonization of these martyrs, and also the use of broadsides, the point I want to make is that Ribadeneira is trying all the time to compare these martyrs with Christ himself. And of course, the comparison is in terms of how they died makes sense, because they were executed in the same manner on the cross. But look at the title of the chapter. Cómo en la vida y muerte de estos gloriosos mártires vieron los japoneses un vivo retrato de la vida y muerte de Jesucristo nuestro Señor. So he's claiming it is not just their death that echoes the death of Christ, also their lives. No? And he starts to develop several arguments and comparisons, some of them quite far-fetched actually, to try to make the point that these people actually lived like Christ. No? This is something that, for instance, the Jesuits weren't very happy about, and actually they complained, and there were huge controversies between both orders. In any case, the topic of the group martyrdom is something that appears quite often in the broadsides, like this idea, if you want to write something sensationalist with a lot of blood and glory that would entertain like popular audiences, then of course the more victims, the greater the horror. No? And I have found examples of broadsides involving torture and execution of groups of Catholics, but it's often like groups, smaller groups, like 8 martyrs in one case, or 5 martyrs in another, but 26 martyrs executed together. That's something that was really new in the early modern world. You might find examples in ancient Rome with the persecution of the first Christians, but not in the early modern world. No? And that's something that Ribadeneira is emphasizing all the time throughout his chronicle. This martyrdom is cosa tan nueva, such a novel thing. We have never seen anything like that, 26 Christians crucified together. So in this case, reality exceeds even the exaggerations of the literatura de cordel that he, I would argue, was so fond of. And another thing that he's doing, which he might be borrowing from his broadsides as well, is this idea of already calling these people saints. I mean, you were, according to the Council of Trent, the 25th decree of the Council of Trent, that's 1563, you were not supposed to call somebody saint before the actual process of canonization. There were some procedures that had to be followed before you could consider somebody a saint. And yet Ribadeneira considers that this is a mere formality, and that it is so evident that these people are saints because they died because of their faith, because it's the reason you die is the key thing. No, you die because of your faith, because you refuse to recant your faith. Then you are automatically, almost automatically a saint. Miracles are not even necessary when you are a martyr. So it is so obvious from his perspective that he's already trying to preempt the future judgment of the church, and he's already calling them saints, calling them martyrs, using the word miracle, etc. That's something that we find often in early modern sources, I would say, also with Jesuit chronicles of the Philippines. Also, the events happened so far away, and he was the only survivor who wrote about it, or who wrote extensively about it. So I think he feels like he has more of an authoritative position, you know, to make these kind of statements. And finally, I would say that the most important supernatural events take place in the aftermath. Once the martyrs are already dead, we find the stroke of the incorrupt bodies, which is of course something that you find everywhere, not just in the broadsides, also in hagiographies. It's very common, this idea that the body of a saint smells wonderfully, etc. I have even found a broadside that jokes about the throat, that jokes about the body of Saint Teresa smelling so wonderfully. Ribadeneira couldn't make any joke, of course, on this topic. He's writing an official history, but he's definitely resorting to the throat. And he even says that the animals respect the bodies, because the Japanese emperor said that nobody was allowed to remove the bodies from the crosses. They had to stay there until they would fall for themselves. So the bodies stayed there for 9 months. And according to the Ribadeneira, even the animals were pious and respectful, which is something you find in broadsides of street literature. I found a pamphlet from 1630 printed in Barcelona, in which a dog is accompanying a dying man to receive the last rites, and the dog itself is praying in the broadside. Now that's the type of content that you find in these religious broadsides. And the crows are not praying, but they are respecting their bodies, and they are more respectful actually than the people. The animals are more respectful than the actual people, as we will see in a minute. The most spectacular supernatural event, I would say, is this kind of periodical resurrection of Pedro Bautista. Pedro Bautista was the leader of the Franciscan mission, and according to Marcelo de Ribadeneira, even though he was dead, he had died on the cross. Every Friday and Saturday, the body would disappear from the cross so that he would perform this mass for Christians of Nagasaki, and then he returned to the cross. No? And this is some kind of a eternal miracle or periodical record. It's repeated every week. No? He disappears from the cross, performs the mass, and then goes back to the cross. That is an interesting miracle, because this idea of a supernatural mass, which is repeated periodically, becomes very important in Philippine folklore, and actually becomes central in a major work, literary work of Filipino literature in the 20th century. So that's the reason why I was mentioning. But the most gory detail, spectacularly gory detail I have found is this line that I'm reproducing here, which really, you could find that's the type of content that you would find in a broadside of a street literature. You know, early modern Europeans were eager to get relics. Relics were extremely important for the spiritual devotion in the Catholic world. But then we find somebody who actually, a 2 días después de muerto el Santo Comisario, Pedro Bautista, cortándole uno el dedo pulgar del pie con los dientes, salió mucha sangre. ¿No? So according to Ribadeneira, someone would go there and bite a toe of Pedro Bautista to get that relic. No? And he describes actually in very graphic details the dismemberment of so the animals were very respectful, didn't dare to touch them, but actually humans were eager to get those relics. And among them was none other than Ribadeneira himself, who claims that por mi diligencia vinieron a mis manos. So he managed to gather many relics, like parts of bodies, bones, etc., of those martyrs. And then he started some kind of triumphal return to Europe, in which he was distributing those relics in the Philippines, in Manila, in Mexico. The saint patron of Mexico City, San Felipe de Jesus, was one of those martyrs in Nagasaki, and Ribadeneira left a relic of him, or several in Mexico City and Puebla. And then when he arrived in Spain, he had already run out of relics, and then what he did was to promote the elaboration of paintings to remember the martyrs of Nagasaki. And that's a very important point also in the 25th decrees of the Council of Trent, that both relics and paintings should be used to promote devotion and to promote, to strengthen the Catholic faith. And Ribadeneira claims that Philip III was deeply moved by a painting of Nagasaki, and we know that his father, Philip II, gathered a collection of more than 7,000 relics in El Escorial. No? So you can see how Ribadeneira is using these two very important tenets of counter-Reformation religiosity, relics and paintings, in order to drive home his point about these martyrs. There is a fresco representing the Nagasaki martyrs in the Cathedral of Cuernavaca in Mexico. This was only discovered in the mid-20th century when the walls were cleaned. So you can see here the connection, Japan-Mexico via Philippines. And I'm now transitioning to the conclusions. Okay, so bear with me 2-3 minutes, and then we'll have the Q&A. I'm almost done with the paper. I just wanted to say, to conclude, that the posterity has not been kind with this chronicle of Ribadeneira. Unlike the other chronicles, this was never reprinted in the early modern period until 1947, which is interesting because it's in Franco's Spain, 8 years after the end of the Civil War, when a Franciscan decides to republish this chronicle. He changes the title, Evangelización de Filipinas y Japón, no, which strengthens the connection between the two archipelagos. And of course the paratexts are full of cliches of national Catholicism, no, that Spain did glorious deeds, evangelizing the world, etc. So it's, I mean, from a scholarly perspective, it's a very dated edition, but it's interesting to see how this text was approached and studied in Franco's Spain. And this edition of 1947 was the basis for the Philippine translation, because there's a Filipino edition, bilingual English-Spanish, that was published in 1970 by the Historical Society of Manila. And you might think, well, actually this text of Ribadeneira, I mean, it looks like a very niche topic, and it is a niche topic. But then when I was in Manila in February, and I had the privilege of accessing the library of Nick Joaquin, who's widely considered the most important Anglophone Filipino writer of the 20th century, I did find a copy of an annotated copy of Marcelo de Ribadeneira. So clearly Nick Joaquin read the book. And in fact, in this, this is the American edition, by the way, of Nick Joaquin, The Woman Who Had Two Navels. It can easily be found in any bookshop or on Amazon. And this is the Spanish edition of Nick Joaquin that I was lucky, I had the privilege to translate him myself. And the point I wanted to make is that there's a story written by Nick Joaquin entitled The Mass of San Sylvester, in which there's a pope who, even though he's dead, every San Sylvester, every New Year's Eve, he appears miraculously in the Cathedral of Manila to perform a supernatural mass. So you will remember, this resonates or this echoes the supernatural masses of Pedro Bautista every Friday and Saturday at Nagasaki. So I would argue that there's a connection that, and in fact that happens often with these texts. They might seem very niche and obscure, but if you start studying like the literature produced in the Philippines in the 20th century, 19th century, both in Spanish and in English, you often find that type of connection. It's not that these chronicles that were written as with very official goals, like in this case, promoting the canonization of these martyrs, and that use this modest corpus of literature as this street literature, this roadside that I mentioned, often became like foundational for Filipino literature that was developed centuries later. Thank you very much.
Questions? We now have a few minutes, 15, 20 minutes for questions. We can do it in English, Spanish, both. I think all of us can do both languages. Ah, sorry, yes. Sí.
Do you know why he was on the ship instead of on land with everyone else? Did he know it was going to happen?
Yeah, he was, it was like some kind of house arrest, like the Japanese forced him to be on that ship and witness the martyrdom, but they didn't want to kill him. Maybe because they wanted somebody to be witness to that event and who would tell later the story. Because from the viewpoint of the Japanese emperor, what they wanted was the missionaries to stop coming to Japan. So I guess that not killing everybody made sense, so that there could be a few survivors who would tell the story in the Philippines and elsewhere, so that missionaries would stop coming to Japan. It's a bit of a hypothesis, but I think it would make sense that that was the logic behind it. Yeah.
Thanks for such a fascinating presentation. There's so many connections that I think, when I think about the Japanese perspective and what you said about masculinity and martyrdom, first I have several little questions. Is there any analogous event in which an emperor from another country thought of crucifying Christians? I mean, it just seems so humorous, gory, but humorous on the part of the Japanese to execute the Christians in their own language, right? Rather than some other form of execution, which might have been more common in Japan.
I mean, the only evidence I have in this regard is that crucifixion was a common form of execution in Japan for thieves. I don't think the emperor was thinking of replicating the execution of Christ.
Mhm.
It was simply a form of execution that they had for thieves.
Okay.
But I don't think it was his intention to echo what happened.
Okay, so then it just becomes this thing that
Yeah,
Ribadeneira can exploit.
yeah.
And I wondered too about the audience for his text, if there was any early modern Japanese or Filipino audience for the text, or if it was, you know, it seems like such an act of desperation to go back to Europe with the bodies of these executed Christians, and somehow to turn this around, to reframe this as a glorious event for Europeans is, it's interesting propaganda, right? But were there underground Japanese Christians that saw this the same way?
Yeah, there were underground Japanese Christians, although many of them started to leave the country and went to the Philippines
Mhm.
as some kind of safe haven for Japanese Christians. I have found a Japanese broadside produced by Franciscans. So they wrote it in Spanish and then they had it translated.
Mhm.
And it was a pamphlet, a broadside about the martyrdom.
Mhm.
But otherwise, I think that really the martyrdom of these 26 Christians was forgotten in Japan, and it's mostly in the West, in Europe, in Mexico, where they were remembered, you know, which is paradoxical because in the country where they died, I mean, I think the Japanese rulers were quite successful in eradicating Christianity from their land. That's not the message that Ribadeneira wants to convey,
Mhm.
but I do think that that's what the historical evidence suggests, that they were quite successful. But they were, of course, remembered, and the event became very important outside of Japan, not so
Mhm.
much in Japan. The first saint of the Philippines was a Filipino mestizo by the name Lorenzo Ruiz,
Mhm.
who was also executed in Nagasaki, but a few decades later, in 1637. And he's the first Filipino saint. So you can see how the memory of these martyrs was preserved mostly in other countries, no?
Mhm.
Throughout the Spanish Empire. In the case of Japan, I mean, there's a famous novel. It's not about Nagasaki, but
Mhm.
there's a canonical novel about the persecution of Japanese Christians, which is entitled Silence, which inspired the movie by Martin Scorsese,
Mhm.
exactly. No? So there's that connection. No? But it's not specifically about Nagasaki 1597, but of course the persecution was much longer. It lasted decades. No?
Mhm.
Thank you.
No, yeah, I was thinking about too the recent miniseries, the recent Shogun miniseries, and the way that this might be alive in the imagination of people in the West, and just Filipino and Japanese international relations as well, because Japan, was successful in eliminating Christianity, whereas Christianity is the major religion of the Philippines. And what is the difference in terms of the religious context? I mean, obviously, Japan had a lot more technical. It was incredibly advanced, right? But it also had Buddhism, where Buddhism had never arrived in the Philippines. It just seems like there's a lot of relevance to your project in thinking about the complexity of relations today.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you for that. It's very interesting. I was wondering, how do you, corner the idea of many of the sources of Ribadeneira from literatura de cordel instead of other, sources of drops? How you narrow that source? Because there are some events that are extraordinary, and you can tell, hey, that can appear in a sensationalist source, but how can you do the cleaning of that area?
No, No, that's a very good point. Thank you. And I'm starting to rethink actually my approach, because I do think that, I mean, I do think there's common ground with literatura de cordel, and that's something that I found across the chronicles of the Philippines, not just with Ribadeneira. But at the same time, I do think that there are many other sources. For instance, this idea of these gory aesthetics, no, this emphasis on this. Cioran, the Romanian philosopher, he used this expression, voluptuousness of suffering. No? Este regodeo, we would say in Spanish. That's something you find in the broadsides, but you also find it in highbrow epic literature. I mean, the poem we discussed, Alberto, the religious epic poem about Ignatius Loyola, written in colonial Colombia by Dominguez Camargo, is full of this type of gory aesthetics. No? It's something that went across genres. No? So to focus just on the literatura de cordel as a source might be a bit too narrow. And that's the reason why I'm thinking of expanding this. I think particularly the connection with epic poetry, the idea that I presented in the paper that he's not just writing history, he's doing some kind of religious epic as well, in which the new heroes are these martyrs, that would serve to find common ground with other sources, and I think that would make a lot of sense. So it's a book that has a wide range of sources, from the most highbrow, exquisite epic poems to the most popular and simple and straightforward broadsides.
Yeah, to follow up on what you were saying, Luis, I think, because you mentioned something that I keep kind of thinking about, is that you mentioned this morning in the class, that you mentioned that, for example, that one of the main differences with the conquest of the New World is that the lack of kind of soldiers. No, there was the balance between missionaries and soldiers was the reverse in the Philippines. So I'm wondering if that's something that is in maybe in Ribadeneira's project is also an epic for missionaries. There's no the epic of the soldier, of the conquistador. It's prevalent in the Americas, but it's not. Maybe it's the lack of the soldier conquistador will produce or would need this kind of epic that is missionary, religious, about martyrdom, about suffering, about the life of Christ, etc. I don't know if that's something.
No, I love that idea. We lack an epic poem about the conquest of the Philippines. We have epic poems about Hernán Cortés. We have La Araucana about the conquest of Chile. We don't have an epic about the conquest of the Philippines. And I like the idea that he's somehow filling that gap, by presenting another kind of epic, another kind of hero, which is the missionary.
Which is dying, which is kind
dying,
of the opposite of the hero.
Yeah.
Is like acts by dying. No, it's very, very interesting. That idea.
I like it. Thank you, Alberto. Any other question, comment?
Well, if there aren't any other questions, well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Luis. With that, we can